It all started with a slap in first class. Then, the pilot received a call that grounded the entire aircraft. Max didn't require much for his flight, just a window seat, a bit of peace, and a cold beverage to enjoy during the journey. He had arrived early at LAX, dressed in a dark navy hoodie, tailored black trousers, and brand new sneakers that gleamed under the airport lights. A sleek carry-on bag glided behind him as he walked through the terminal. With his AirPods in place, he preferred to listen to the hustle and bustle around him rather than immerse himself in music. As he moved through the crowd, people glanced at him, curiosity etched on their faces, trying to determine who he was. Too polished to be just another traveler, yet too young to be a businessman, Max carried an air of quiet confidence. He rarely smiled, not out of unfriendliness, but because he was naturally reserved and observant. To know him better, one had to earn his trust. Upon arriving at the gate, the ticket agent scanned his boarding pass without a second look. Max proceeded down the jet bridge into the cool, narrow passageway of the plane. He settled into seat 2A in first class, where the other passengers were already getting comfortable. An older couple occupied 1C and 1D. Two businessmen chatted in 2C and 2D, while a young mother across the aisle struggled to buckle her seatbelt with one hand, her toddler squirming in the other. There was no fuss, but a few heads turned as Max made his way to his seat. He noticed the glances, as he always did. It was something he had grown accustomed to. The flight attendant strolled past him at first, a woman in her 40s with shoulder-length blonde hair. Her name tag read R. Smith. Max nodded at her, but she didn't respond. No matter, he thought. A few moments later, she returned with drinks for the passengers, serving water, juices, and champagne with practiced grace. However, when she reached his row, her demeanor shifted. Max looked up and removed one AirPod. "Could I get a sparkling water, please? No ice," he requested. Her smile faltered, just enough for him to notice. "We're still boarding, sir," she replied, her tone clipped. Okay, no rush. Just whenever you get a chance," he said calmly. She stared at him longer than necessary before walking away. The man across the aisle raised an eyebrow, muttering, "That was odd." Max didn't respond. He simply put his AirPod back in and leaned against the window. This wasn't the first time he had encountered such treatment, but something felt different this time. Minutes passed as he glanced at his watch, feeling the warmth of the cabin. He noticed the flight attendant again, this time chatting happily with a passenger 2 rows behind him. Still, no sparkling water. Curiosity piqued. Max pressed the call button, not out of thirst, but to see how she would react. She approached with a tight jaw, her expression different, defensive. "Yes?" she said flatly. "Hey, just checking on that sparkling water?" he asked, politely. "I thought you might have forgotten." She hesitated before responding. "I didn't forget," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. A few heads turned toward them, and Max felt the tension in the air. The man in 2D shifted uncomfortably, sensing the growing discord. "Come on," he muttered, trying to diffuse the situation. Max held up his hands, not in aggression but to signal that he meant no harm. "I wasn't trying to be rude. I just asked for a drink." Her expression hardened. "You people always have something to say," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. Max's brow furrowed in disbelief. "What did I do to deserve that?" "All I asked for was water," he replied, looking around at the other passengers, who now watched intently. The young mother tightened her grip on her child, while the older couple in 1C and 1D exchanged confused glances, feeling the atmosphere shift dramatically. The flight attendant returned minutes later, this time without a drink and full of attitude. "I don't appreciate your tone. If you can't behave, I'll have to ask the captain to remove you from the flight before we take off." Max laughed softly, disbelief flashing across his face. "You're threatening to kick me off because I asked for a drink? That seems excessive." He maintained an even tone, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. More passengers began to pull out their phones, recording the unfolding drama. As the situation escalated, it became clear that what had started as a simple request had turned into something much larger, casting a shadow over the entire flight. Max remained calm, but the atmosphere was charged, and everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see how it would resolve. Max Evans was not your typical first-class passenger. As he sat in seat 2A, the soft hum of the airplane engines filled the air, but he was a world away in his own thoughts. He was a 20-something with an air of quiet confidence, dressed in a dark navy hoodie that contrasted sharply with the polished surroundings of first class. His tailored black trousers and pristine sneakers hinted at a sense of style that was both effortless and intentional. His carry-on bag was sleek and understated, rolling smoothly behind him as he made his way through the airport earlier that day. Max had a keen awareness of his surroundings, often absorbing the atmosphere without feeling the need to engage. He preferred to listen rather than speak, a trait that allowed him to pick up on the subtleties of social interactions around him. On this flight, he wore his AirPods, but not for music. He liked to remain attuned to the conversations and sounds around him, ready to respond if needed. This habit had always intrigued those seated nearby, who often cast curious glances his way, attempting to categorize him. Was he an entrepreneur, a tech prodigy, or just a young man who happened to find himself in first class by chance? Despite the attention he occasionally garnered, Max rarely smiled. Those who knew him understood that his reserved nature was not a sign of rudeness. Rather, it was a reflection of his introspective personality. He was observant and contemplative, often lost in thought as he analyzed the world around him. For Max, opening up to others required trust, something that took time to build. As the flight attendant, R. Smith, passed him without acknowledgement, Max felt the familiar sensation of scrutiny from the passengers nearby. Even as he nodded politely at her, she seemed to look right through him, a slight glance that conveyed disinterest. It was a subtle reminder of the biases that lingered in society, assumptions made based on appearance. The older couple in 1C and 1D exchanged whispers, their faces expressing a mix of curiosity and judgment, while the businessmen in 2C and 2D continued their conversation, oblivious to the tension starting to build. When R. Smith returned with drinks, her cheerful demeanor faded as she reached Max. His request for a sparkling water was met with a clipped response, and Max felt a flicker of discomfort. He had encountered this kind of treatment before, being perceived as someone who didn't belong in such an upscale environment, simply because of his casual attire. This time, however, something about her attitude struck him as particularly off. It wasn't just the refusal of his drink. It was the way she looked at him, as if he were an inconvenience rather than a valued guest. Max was determined not to let the situation escalate, but as he pressed the call button, he felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The confrontation that followed was both unexpected and revealing. R. Smith's tone shifted drastically, and her comments hinted at something deeper, bias perhaps, rooted in preconceived notions about people who looked like him. The atmosphere in the cabin thickened as other passengers began to take notice, their attention drawn to the escalating tension. As the flight progressed, it became increasingly clear that Max was not just fighting for a simple drink. He was challenging the assumptions that people made based on appearances. He remained calm, but the undercurrents of prejudice that surfaced in that moment opened a door to a larger conversation, one that would unfold dramatically as the flight continued. In the confined space of the airplane, the dynamics of power, privilege, and perception were about to collide in ways that none of the passengers could have anticipated. The atmosphere in first class shifted as the tension escalated between Max and R. Smith. What began as a simple request for a drink had spiraled into a confrontation that drew the attention of everyone nearby. Max leaned back in his seat, attempting to maintain his composure, but he could feel the weight of the gazes from the other passengers. He was determined not to come across as confrontational. His intention was merely to clarify a misunderstanding. "Excuse me," Max said, trying to keep his tone even as R. Smith approached him again. I just wanted to check on that sparkling water I asked for earlier. I noticed you've been busy, but I'd really appreciate it if you could bring it to me when you get a chance." His voice was calm, almost soothing, but the underlying frustration was palpable. R. Smith's expression hardened as she crossed her arms, her demeanor shifting from professional to defensive. "I told you, sir. We were still boarding," she replied, her voice clipped and impatient. "You can't expect to be served when there are still passengers coming on board." The irritation in her tone was unmistakable, and it set off a ripple of unease among the other passengers. Max could sense their eyes on him, waiting to see how he would react. "I understand that, but I asked for a drink, not a full meal," he responded, trying to keep the situation from escalating further. "I didn't mean to come off as demanding. I just thought it was a simple request." His demeanor remained calm, but R. Smith was clearly not willing to back down. "You're being very demanding for someone who hasn't even taken off yet," she shot back, her voice rising slightly. The man seated in 2D shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, glancing from Max to R. Smith, hoping to diffuse the situation. Max, however, was unfazed. He raised his hands slightly, a gesture meant to convey that he meant no harm. "I'm not trying to be rude. I just asked for a drink. If that's considered demanding, perhaps there's a misunderstanding here." The way he spoke was measured, but the frustration was beginning to seep through. "Is there a problem here?" a passenger in the front row called out, intrigued by the escalating drama. Max could feel the eyes of the cabin on him, and he took a deep breath, trying to center himself. R. Smith seemed to realize the attention they were drawing, her composure faltering for just a moment as she glanced around the cabin. But then, in a moment of frustration, she muttered something under her breath, loud enough for Max to catch. "You people always have something to say." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. Max's brow furrowed in disbelief, and he turned toward her. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The cabin fell silent, and the tension was palpable. Max's heart raced, but he remained composed, determined not to let the situation spiral out of control. The young mother across the aisle instinctively pulled her toddler closer, sensing the shift in the air. The older couple in 1C and 1D exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do. "Did you really just say that?" Max pressed, disbelief etched on his face. R. Smith seemed to realize the weight of her words, but instead of apologizing, her frustration boiled over. "You're being combative," she snapped, her voice louder now, drawing even more attention from the passengers. Max couldn't believe what was happening. I simply asked for a drink. If you consider that combative, maybe we need to reevaluate what being polite means," he replied, his voice firm but calm. The other passengers began to murmur among themselves, their phones coming out as they started to record the exchange. It was becoming clear that this was no longer just a simple disagreement over a drink. It was a much larger issue, one that showcased the biases and assumptions that people often held. Max remained calm, but he could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The eyes of the cabin were now fully focused on him and R. Smith, the atmosphere thick with anticipation as everyone awaited the next move in this unexpected confrontation. As the tension in the cabin reached a boiling point, Max felt a surge of frustration mixed with disbelief. R. Smith's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The other passengers were now fully engaged, their phones out, recording what was unfolding before them. Max knew he had to remain composed, but the contempt in her voice struck a nerve. "You think you can just come in here and demand special treatment?" R. Smith accused, her expression hardening. "You're not above anyone else just because you're sitting in first class." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, a mix of confusion and disbelief at what they were witnessing. Max could feel the weight of their gazes, and he took a deep breath, trying to maintain his calm. "Look, I'm not asking for special treatment," he replied, his voice steady. "I simply requested a drink. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The sincerity in his tone seemed to resonate with some passengers, who nodded in agreement. Yet, R. Smith remained defiant, her posture rigid as she crossed her arms. "You're being very combative for someone who hasn't even taken off yet," she snapped back, her voice rising again. The man seated in 2D shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that things were escalating beyond a mere disagreement. "Come on, just let it go," he muttered, hoping to diffuse the situation. But Max wasn't going to back down. "Combative? All I did was ask for water," Max replied, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "If that's considered combative, then perhaps we need to have a serious conversation about customer service." He glanced around the cabin, noticing several passengers nodding, their expressions reflecting support for him. R. Smith's face flushed with anger. "You need to lower your voice," she retorted sharply, her tone filled with irritation. Max held his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm speaking at the same volume I used when I first asked for water. If you feel threatened, maybe it's because you expected me to just accept your refusal without question." At that moment, a passenger in the back of the cabin stood up. "Hey, did you just say what I think you said?" he challenged R. Smith, his tone incredulous. The flight attendant turned to him, but her response was cut off as she noticed more eyes on her. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and it seemed that the entire cabin was now involved in the unfolding drama. Before R. Smith could respond, she leaned closer to Max, her voice low and sharp. "You think you're special, don't you? Just because you're sitting up here like you belong." The word stung, and Max felt a chill run down his spine. It was a blatant display of prejudice that could not be ignored. In a sudden move, R. Smith lifted her hand and slapped Max across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin, and gasps filled the air as the reality of the situation set in. Silence enveloped the plane as every passenger froze in shock. The toddler across the aisle began to cry, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere. Max slowly turned his head to face her, a mix of disbelief and calmness washing over him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't react with anger. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Hey," he said into the device, his voice steady and clear. "It's me. I need you to handle something." The gravity of his words hung in the air, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers exchanged glances, realizing that this was no ordinary confrontation. Max's demeanor remained calm, unfazed by the slap. He continued speaking into the phone, his eyes fixed on R. Smith. "I'm on flight 482 to LA first class, seat 2A. The flight attendant just struck me in front of at least 20 witnesses." His cool composure was striking, especially against the backdrop of chaos. The flight attendant's face paled as the reality of her actions sunk in. She was no longer in control of the situation. The passengers began to murmur among themselves, the unease palpable as they processed what had just happened. Max's phone call signaled that this was not just a personal dispute. It was about to involve someone with power and influence. The shift in dynamics was unmistakable. Max remained seated, one hand on his cheek where she had struck him, the other still holding his phone. He was calm, but the tension in the cabin was electric. All eyes were now on him, waiting to see how this would unfold and what would come next. The flight had taken a turn that no one had anticipated, and the atmosphere was charged with uncertainty and intrigue. In the tense silence that followed the slap, the mood in the cabin shifted dramatically. Max remained seated, his expression unreadable as he continued his phone call, while R. Smith stood frozen, her face pale and trembling. The air was thick with disbelief, and the murmurs among the passengers grew louder, punctuated by the occasional gasp. No one had expected such an explosive confrontation on a routine flight. Did that really just happen? A passenger whispered, glancing around at the others, who were equally astonished. The man in 2D, who had been trying to mediate earlier, leaned forward, clearly agitated. "I can't believe she hit him," he muttered, shaking his head. The older couple, 1C and 1D, exchanged worried glances, their expressions reflecting shock and concern. Meanwhile, Max spoke into his phone, maintaining a calm demeanor. "Yes, I'm fine," he assured the person on the other end. "But I need you to take this seriously. I'm on flight 482 to Los Angeles, and the flight attendant just assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses." His voice was steady, and it carried an air of authority that commanded attention. Passengers began to take out their phones, some recording the unfolding drama, while others whispered among themselves, trying to grasp the full scope of what had just happened. The young mother across the aisle held her child tightly, her eyes wide with concern. "This isn't right," she said softly to her husband. "He didn't deserve that." As Max continued his call, the flight attendant's bravado began to crumble. She glanced around the cabin, but the passengers were no longer on her side. The man who had previously spoken up stood up again, his voice firm. "I'm going to tell the pilot what just happened," he declared, making his way toward the front of the plane. R. Smith flinched, realizing that her actions had consequences far beyond her initial impulse. "Please don't do that," she pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. "It was just a misunderstanding." But her words fell on deaf ears. The man ignored her, striding toward the cockpit with purpose. Max watched the exchange, his heart racing as he realized that the tide was turning against her. The pilot emerged from the cockpit, a tall figure with gray hair and a commanding presence. "What's going on here?" he asked, surveying the tense scene. The man who had approached the front gestured toward Max. "She hit him, unprovoked. There are witnesses all around." The pilot turned to R. Smith, his expression stern. "Is that true?" She opened her mouth to respond but faltered, her words stumbling out in a disjointed manner. "He was being aggressive. He was rude." "Did he touch you?" the pilot interrupted sharply. R. Smith shook her head, and the pilot narrowed his eyes. "Did he raise his voice?" Again she hesitated before shaking her head. The pilot's gaze hardened. "I need you to step into the galley. Now." As she walked away, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted once more. Max could feel the tension begin to dissipate, replaced by a sense of solidarity among the passengers. They had witnessed something significant, and it was clear that many supported Max. "Are you okay, man?" the passenger in the Navy sport coat asked Max, still recording. "That was messed up." Max nodded slowly, appreciating the concern. "I'm all right. Just disappointed," he replied, his voice calm. More passengers began to speak up, sharing their observations. "I saw her hit him. He didn't do anything to provoke that," one woman said, her voice rising in confidence. Another added, "She called him, you people." What does that even mean? The collective outrage in the cabin was palpable, and it was clear that R. Smith's actions had consequences that extended beyond the immediate situation. Back in Phoenix, as the plane taxied toward the runway, the news of the incident began to spread rapidly. Max's phone buzzed with notifications as social media lit up with reactions to the unfolding drama. The situation was no longer just a personal conflict. It was becoming a public spectacle, one that would spark conversations about privilege, bias, and accountability. As the plane came to a stop, Max felt a mix of emotions. He had not sought confrontation, but now he found himself at the center of a significant moment, one that had the potential to lead to real change.
The pilot returned to the cabin, his expression serious. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to return to the gate for a brief security matter. Thank you for your understanding."
Passengers exchanged looks of disbelief and anticipation, realizing that this situation was far from over. Max sat quietly, knowing that the repercussions of this incident would echo beyond the confines of the airplane.
The confrontation had ignited a spark, and he was determined to see it through. As he glanced around at the passengers, he felt a sense of solidarity. They were all part of something larger now. A moment that challenged the status quo and demanded accountability.
As the plane remained grounded, the reality of the situation began to sink in for everyone on board. Passengers exchanged whispers, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and many were eager to see how this incident would unfold. Max sat quietly in his seat, his expression calm, but his mind racing with thoughts about what had just happened. He knew that this was about more than just a drink or an insult. It was about confronting the biases that lay hidden beneath the surface of everyday interactions. Once the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, the pilot returned to address the passengers. "Thank you for your patience, everyone," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We're currently addressing an incident that occurred on board. Please remain seated while we assess the situation." His words hung heavy in the air, and Max felt a wave of support from those around him. They were all witnesses to the confrontation,
And it seemed that many were eager to ensure that R. Smith would face consequences for her actions.
As the passengers sat in silence, Max took a moment to gather his thoughts. He had not come onto the flight looking for trouble, but now he felt a sense of responsibility. He didn't want to just walk away from this incident. He wanted to ensure that something meaningful came from it. He had seen how easily biases could manifest in everyday situations, and he knew that they needed to be addressed openly and honestly. When the pilot returned to the cabin, he approached Max directly. "Sir, I apologize for what happened. I'm going to make sure this is handled appropriately," he said, his tone sincere. Max appreciated the pilot's acknowledgement of the situation, but he knew that it wasn't enough. He felt compelled to advocate for accountability, not just for himself, but for others who might face similar prejudices in the future. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't just want her to be fired or punished quietly," Max replied. "I want the airline to acknowledge what happened publicly. It's important that they take a stand against discrimination and ensure that their staff undergoes proper training." His voice was steady, and he could see the pilot nodding in agreement. "Understood," the pilot said. "I'll communicate that to the airline's operations team immediately." Meanwhile, the passengers around Max began to voice their support. "He's right," one man said. "This isn't just about him. It's about how people are treated based on their appearance." Several others chimed in, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and bias. The conversation grew, transforming the cabin into a space for open dialogue about the issues that had been brought to light. As the discussions continued, Max felt a sense of hope. It was clear that the incident had resonated with many people, and they were willing to engage in a conversation that needed to happen. He realized that this was his chance to amplify the message, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been judged or dismissed unfairly. After a short while, a representative from the airline arrived at the gate, a serious expression on her face. "Thank you all for your patience," she began. "We are currently conducting an internal review of the incident, and I want to assure you that we take this matter very seriously. We are committed to ensuring that our staff is properly trained to provide respectful service to all passengers." Max listened intently, knowing that this was just the beginning. He wanted to make sure that the airline not only addressed the incident, but also implemented changes that would prevent similar occurrences in the future. "I appreciate that you're taking this seriously," he said, standing up to address the representative. "But it's vital that this isn't just a temporary fix. There needs to be a long-term commitment to addressing bias and ensuring that all passengers are treated with respect, regardless of how they look." The representative nodded, visibly taken aback by Max's passion. "We will review our training protocols and work to enhance our diversity and inclusion programs," she assured him. As the conversation continued, Max felt a surge of determination. He realized that this moment could lead to real change, not just for him, but for countless others who had faced similar challenges. As the plane was eventually cleared for the passengers to disembark, Max knew that he had taken the first step toward holding the airline accountable. The incident would not be forgotten. It was now a catalyst for conversation and, hopefully, transformation. As he stepped off the plane, he felt a sense of purpose. The support of the other passengers had solidified his resolve to seek accountability, and he was ready to ensure that their voices were heard. Together, they could challenge the status quo and create a more respectful environment for everyone, regardless of their appearance or background. The journey was just beginning, and Max was determined to see it through. After the incident on Flight 482, the atmosphere surrounding Max began to shift dramatically. News of the altercation had spread quickly, igniting discussions on social media and prompting a wave of support from those who had witnessed the event. Within hours, clips of the confrontation had gone viral, and Max found himself at the center of a national conversation about discrimination and bias. The public response was overwhelming, with many people sharing their own experiences of being marginalized or judged based on their appearance. As the days passed, Max reflected on what had transpired.
He had not anticipated that a simple request for a drink would escalate into such a significant moment. Yet here he was, facing the reality that his experience
Resonated with countless others. He felt a deep sense of responsibility to leverage this moment for positive change, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been subjected to unfair treatment. The airline's response was swift. They issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the incident and expressing their commitment to conducting a thorough investigation.
Max appreciated that they were taking the matter seriously, but he knew that words alone were not enough. He wanted to ensure that the airline would follow through with meaningful actions that addressed the underlying issues of bias and discrimination. With the support of his family and friends, Max decided to take a proactive approach. He reached out to civil rights organizations, seeking their guidance on how to advocate for systemic change within the airline industry. Together, they crafted a plan that included calls for better training for airline staff, the implementation of diversity and inclusion initiatives, and a commitment to transparency in reporting incidents of discrimination. The response from the public was heartening. Max began to receive invitations to speak at events and forums where he could share his story and engage in conversations about bias and respect. He used these opportunities to highlight the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their appearance or background. No one should have to prove their worth to be treated with respect, he stated passionately during one of his speeches. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us taking a stand against prejudice and ensuring that everyone feels they belong. As the airline continued to address the situation, they announced a live press conference to publicly apologize to Max and to outline their plans for change. On the day of the conference, Max watched as the spokesperson took the podium, expressing regret for the incident and committing to a new anti-bias training program for all employees. The announcement was a step in the right direction, but Max felt that more needed to be done. After the press conference, Max released a video on his father's foundation page, emphasizing the importance of accountability in all areas of life. This wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up for what's right, he said in the video, his voice steady. We need to challenge our assumptions and treat each other with kindness and respect. It's time for all of us to reflect on how we can do better.
In the days that followed, Max's message resonated with many. People began sharing stories of their own experiences with discrimination, and the conversation shifted from individual incidents to a broader dialogue about societal change. Max realized that this moment had sparked something powerful, a movement toward greater awareness and understanding.
As he walked through the airport days later, he noticed the smiles and nods of acknowledgement from the staff and passengers alike. There was a newfound sense of respect in the air, a recognition that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. Max knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he felt hopeful. The incident on Flight 482 had become more than just a personal confrontation. It was now a catalyst for change. Max was determined to continue his advocacy, ensuring that the lessons learned would lead to a more inclusive future for all. As he looked ahead, he felt a sense of purpose, ready to keep pushing for progress and to be a voice for those who couldn't speak up for themselves. The journey was far from over, but together, they could make a difference.